This is the Voice of Russia from London. In this show, we're talking about power, who's got it, and if they've got it, what they're doing with it. Like many publications, Forbes Magazine in the USA produces an annual power list, which the editors claim is a snapshot of heads of state, NGO bosses, billionaires, philanthropists and entrepreneurs. They choose one person for every 100 million people on Earth, so the list is now 72 names long. To look at the whole question of how such lists are drawn up and whether we believe in them, I'm joined by three powerful studio guests. Alexander Nekrassov is a former advisor to the Kremlin, and he now runs the controversial blog Stirring Trouble Internationally. From the Times of London, we have the leader writer and columnist Hugo Rifkind, and from Time magazine, we have Catherine Mayer, who's their editor-at-large. Now, the latest Forbes Power List has ruffled some feathers in its home territory by demoting President Barack Obama to second place, and the winner is the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's start at the top. Alexander Nekrassov, what do you make of that?
Well, I think it's probably the right person to be at number one, because we should remember that Mr. Putin has helped to basically save the world. Because if we had the Americans and the Brits and the French, well, the Brits were taken out by their own parliament, attacking Syria with all those chemical weapons there, I don't know what would have happened. I think we would have had a regional war.
You think it reflects very much what's going on in global geopolitics? You think Putin's up there because
of course, because that was a serious development. And let's face it, did we really need a regional war, which might have been turning into a world war? And no, I think it's the right choice.
I'm going to turn to you, Catherine Mayer. I know your magazine, Time, publishes its own list of this type. Some people in the States have said that this is a bit of a slap in the face for Mr. Obama domestically and maybe a political agenda behind this. Do you think he'd be worried by being number two to Vladimir Putin?
I doubt very much that he'd be worried about a list like this, but it's important to understand what these lists actually are. You used the phrase in your introduction just then, the winner. The thing about power lists is they're not endorsements. What they are is a snapshot of the world as it is at the time and as it's perceived. If you were to, you mentioned Time does these lists. I mean, we have an annual Person of the Year. Putin was our Person of the Year in 2007, and the Kremlin certainly decided to see that as a win. They bought up every available copy of Time, as far as I know. But in fact, you know, Hitler has been a Person of the Year. Stalin has been a Person of the Year twice.
So it's not completely a ringing endorsement, is what you're saying.
It is not an endorsement. It is a judgment about who. In our case, I can't speak for Forbes clearly, but in Time's case, it's a forward-looking judgment. So it's not just about who we consider has wielded the most influence in one particular year, but it's a judgment about how we think the world might go. And I think in 2007 that was the correct judgment. And I, for one, would be arguing against Putin for this year. That is not to say that I would be arguing for Obama. I think what is going on in the world at the moment is you see a weakness of leadership pretty much universally. There is one very obvious exception on Forbes's list, which is Angela Merkel. Not that I would, again, necessarily argue for her this year, but I'm not convinced that there are any political leaders who at the moment really look powerful. What you see is different gradations of weakness. You know, we were talking just now, Alexander was talking about Putin's fancy footwork on Syria. That was a PR coup, and it certainly had interesting repercussions in the area. It arose out of a series of blunders and missteps by a whole number of people. If you look at Putin's foreign policy more widely, you can see that he is perhaps acting as much out of weakness as out of strength at the moment.
Well, we'll talk more about the specifics of President Putin a bit later. I'm sure Alexander will want to come back to you on that, Catherine Mayer. But bringing in at the beginning of the programme, Hugo Rifkind from The Times, misstepping, index of weakness according to Catherine Mayer. Poor Mr Cameron down there at number 11. Are you surprised by that?
I think it's fine, and better than fine. I think it's great. I mean, I think it's important to understand what this is measuring here. This is measuring individual power rather than national power. And so for that reason, it should almost be a source of shame to be at the top. I think that might sound strange, but Putin's at the top because there are no checks upon him, because Russia has no functioning executive, because he rules Russia. Obama doesn't even rule Congress, so no wonder he's.
Well, should Mr. Obama indeed even be up at number 2, given what's happened in American politics recently?
I think it's questionable. If you're looking at the world's most powerful people, this is a list that favours tyrants by definition. If you have a system which imposes checks upon your power, as a great many countries do, then you have no business being at the top. And if you are at the top, it shows those checks aren't working.
What do we say about the Pope there at number 4?
Oh, could I just pick up one point? I mean, I mentioned Angela Merkel as being the absolute exception on this list. And the reason I did is because she is in a country that has more inbuilt checks on leaders' power than any other country just about in the world. But this
is not a purely political list, though, is it? I mean, you've got the Pope in there, you've got Angela Merkel.
No, but what I wanted to say about Angela Merkel is that she is somebody who is managing to transcend a position in a purely democratic way, and that is why she is so impressive. Whereas I was also agreeing with what Hugo said, that basically a lot of the politicians on the list are there because of a situation that they're gifted, which is, also obviously why you have Xi Jinping on the list at number 3.
Alexander Nekrassov, should the Pope be up there at number 4?
No, first of all, I'd like to comment on the comments of our guests. They are bad losers, first of all. And to start telling things like, oh, he shouldn't be there. If Obama was there...
I said he should be there.
If Obama was there, you would be gloating and so on. So please, come on. And this is a typical liberal talk.
Obama should be
and of course,
lower.
what is happening in Europe and America is so far detached from democracy in any way at the moment, where the banks are running riot. The banks are running the show in the West. And please, people, stop talking about Putin being a dictator. This is rubbish. This is for journalists of your caliber to say things like that. It's just naive. This cliche about Russia by Western hacks is becoming boring. We have, I don't know how many, 20, 40, 50 Western correspondents in Moscow. And they go out there and write exactly the same rubbish. And then they say, we didn't cover this or that because in Moscow it's all very restricted. Now, if you would be reading the Russian media and Russian newspapers every day, you would be amazed that they write stuff you wouldn't dare write about your leaders and governments and parliaments. Deep, investigative, accusing some officials on the highest levels of corruption, incompetence, and so on. After the crash in 2008, I personally realized the press is impotent in the West. What the banks tell them, they're right. And I still can't understand how people who have allowed those money men to get away with murder are talking about some democracy in their respective countries. Please.
Catherine, would you respond to something that Alexander's touched on there? Is this list really about money to a large extent? Because there are a lot of entrepreneurs on here, a lot of CEOs, a lot of people who control corporations that some of us may not be very familiar with. Angela Merkel, I think if you read the notes on how Forbes drew up this list, it is about the size of GDP in Germany as well.
In terms of how power is distributed in the world, I think a rare area of agreement with Alexander would be that, of course, multinationals and corporations are huge powers. I talked about the lack of power of most leaders. One of the things that you see is one of the reasons for this is the extraordinary reach because of globalization of big companies and the absolute interlinking of all sorts of issues in the world with resources and all of these things that actually erode executive power and democratic power. So yes, absolutely, those people do belong on this list. I don't know whether the specific examples do, but it would be a crazy list not to have them. To me, it is not possible for a leader to demonstrate power by attempting to quash dissent. And so I think one of the many reasons why you'll find skepticism about Putin and his leadership here is, for example, what happened to Pussy Riot. I don't think that there are any strong leaders who would feel the need to quash dissent in that way, because
it
they
has nothing
can.
to do with dissent. It is an offense to the victims of Stalin. This particular church was blown up on the orders of Joseph Stalin. It was rebuilt on people's money as a protest against him. So when those girls started gyrating at the altar, it was an offense. I've lost my relatives to Stalin in labor camps, and I don't like when they do this. They have been doing those dancing routines of theirs all over the place, and nobody did anything to them. It's just like they would have been dancing here at the Westminster Cathedral at the altar. I don't think people would like it.
I don't think the Bolotnaya demonstrators were doing that. I mean, there are any number of examples of people who have found the state moving against them in very repressive ways. So that is why, very naturally, there are concerns about the form of leadership that you have in Russia at the moment.
Every state protects itself. The Cameron government ruthlessly dealt with the students' protests, which were, by the way, legitimate, because they lied to the students about tuition fees. The police provoked violence. You could see it on videos. So every government has something to answer for. Yes, it happens, unfortunately.
Hugo, power is a contentious subject, clearly, and the fact that President Putin is at the top of one of these lists drawn up by journalists, but I don't see the fourth estate represented terribly strongly here on this list. Should there be more journalists on it? There is a CEO of the New York Times fairly down near the bottom, but in terms of power and shaping the way people think about the world, shouldn't the journalists be on this list somewhere?
Well, I mean, there's perhaps more than you'd initially recognise. You've got Jeff Bezos on there, who's just bought the Washington Post. He's a number 15.
He doesn't write, though, does he? Not like you.
No, obviously he's not quite as powerful as me. No, I mean, journalists. I don't approve of journalists either being regarded or regarding themselves as powerful people. So I'm quite
newspaper
happy.
Owners.
Again, the people who are on here, who are newspaper owners, are probably not on here because they're newspaper owners. You know, I mean, Rupert Murdoch.
Down there at number 33.
Newspapers are a very small proportion of his empire. It's very interesting that Mark Zuckerberg comes higher than Rupert Murdoch. It's all about what we're measuring as power.
But does it, I mean, moving aside from the politics and rights and wrongs of national leaders and whether they should be there or not, if you look at that, I mean, people like Zuckerberg, founder and owner of Facebook, surely these are people that shape the way a generation thinks. That is real power, isn't it?
I absolutely think that Zuckerberg should be on there, and I think there are lots of people who should be on this list from that point of view. I think the papacy has symbolic force over a great number of people in the world, but also it goes wider than that because it purports to set a kind of moral agenda for the world. And this
this Pope is the only spiritual leader on this Forbes list. I wonder why that is.
Well, this new Pope has come in and has signalled a desire to make changes, and it'll be really interesting to see where he goes with it. But again, that would be something about this kind of list, as I say, as they should be forward-looking. This Pope is signalling a kind of potentially amazing liberalisation of the way in which the Catholic Church goes about its business, including, for example, now we're hearing the possibility of the first female cardinal. But he did things very early on, you know, he went and washed people's feet, and he did things that had huge symbolic force, and for that reason alone I think he belongs on this list.
And people watch what he does.
Yes.
Well, I think there is a confusion on this list between power and influence, and they're being conflated all the time, and there are many incredibly influential people on here, and there are powerful people on here, and to try and measure the, I don't know what the word is that combines power and influence, but to try and measure somebody like Vladimir Putin against Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, one of them would be a lot better than the other at invading a country, for example. You know, it's
Zuckerberg, presumably.
Well, it depends what manner of invasion was chosen. So I mean, you're never quite comparing sort of like with like in quite the same sort of way.
What's the point of these lists from a journalist point of view? Do they sell magazines, Catherine?
They do. I would not in any way pretend that these are not wonderfully commercial, but the reason that they're wonderfully commercial is because people like to debate these things. You know, every year around this time I get people telling me who they think should be our person of the year, and also telling me very vigorously who they think should not be our person of the year. It is, but they do perform a function beyond that. As I say, they're a really interesting historical document in the end, because every time that these things come out, they give you a snapshot of where, you know, a particular publication or news organisation with its own particular methodologies and often biases and whatever, but it still gives you this snapshot.
I'll stick with you for a second, Catherine Mayer from Time Magazine. I know it's something you've written about. It is a list, and we can dismiss it or laugh at it or respect it. But the role of women and the number of women on the list,
yes.
I think the official figure is 9% of the people on this list. As we talked about earlier, Angela Merkel there, the German Chancellor, in at number 5. But then you have to go all the way down to number 20. The Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, she's there apparently because it's the world's 7th largest economy. Then at 21, the president of the Indian National Congress, India's ruling party and obviously world's 2nd biggest country. And then we go all the way down to 35, Christine Lagarde from the IMF. It's a thin showing, isn't it, for women?
Yes, but that's accurate. One of the very sad things for me as somebody who is frequently involved in the compilation of these lists, because Time actually has 2 listings. We also have the Time 100 that comes out earlier in the year, and then the Person of the Year. So we have this debate twice a year. And we always have a debate about the lack of women on the list and what we should do about it, because the problem is that is a pretty accurate representation of the fact that we are second-class citizens, not just in the countries that people say we're second-class citizens in, but worldwide we are second-class citizens. You know, there are 195 countries in the world. There are only 17 female leaders of those countries. When you look at the reasons women come to power, that often upsets feminists because they often come to power through marriage or through inheritance or some way that does not bespeak the kind of the principles that we would like to espouse, which is that we are as good as everyone, as our male counterparts.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I looked through, if you go through this Forbes list, they give you a bit of biography on all the people on it. And I noticed that most of the women are either single, divorced or widowed. Seems to be, you might assume, tricky for a woman to be part of a functioning nuclear family and rise to any position of power on this list, whereas most of the powerful men have got several children and describe themselves as married. What do you make of that, Hugo?
Well, I mean, I think there are probably almost like greater difficulties in that on any balance of power, I think you probably could make a decent argument that, say, Michelle Obama is probably one of the 100 or so most powerful people in the world. However, that is a power that's entirely as a result of her position and her marriage.
Can I say, I mean, I actually am very much in favour of recognising people like Michelle Obama, precisely because I think that we women would cut off our noses to spite our faces by not acknowledging women who come to power or come to influence or prominence or whatever measure we want to take for reasons that we don't like. One of the reasons that we find it so difficult to break through are not just all the structural issues and the issues about childcare, and you know, in some parts of the world, it starts right at the beginning with education. You know, where girls don't get equal rights to education, but even in parts of the world where we have all of those equalities guaranteed, and even in countries where they have legislated for some kind of attempt to get more women in to businesses on the boards or into Parliament, there is another problem, which is that the media does not represent us equally. I'm sitting here in a room, there are 4 of us, I'm the only woman. That's actually having a 25% woman is a lot better than the usual media representation.
So we're doing well.
I totally disagree with you on every point you made.
But there are
we are
statistics.
now talking feminism, and for no apparent reason. The problem is that people should be judged on merit. That's it. And if you want to fill the boardrooms of big corporations with women and to hell with profit, then it's one thing. But if you want the best of the best, that's another thing. The media, by the way, is overflowing with women. And that is why all this talk is meaningless. Because a company, for example, a private company, doesn't care who you are, a woman or a man or something in between. They want results. The shareholders want results. I don't see that misrepresentation. I see a lot of women in companies. I see a lot of women in the media. For example, you say that women in power here are single or something. Angela Merkel did a lot of backstabbing to get where she is. So you see, these are not sort of oh, these are poor women who managed to get the by luck.
We're talking about the numbers. We're saying, that you can't
Women
argue with the
can
fact
be as
that...
vicious and ruthless in politics or in business as men.
But do they get the chance, I think, is
they
Catherine's
do get
point.
the chance.
May I come back on that? I mean, one of the things that's funny about this is that we were dealing with a lack of statistical understanding or specifics there. I mean, there are any number of studies, both interestingly, that show that when there are women represented on boards, that those companies do better. And there have been a lot of very carefully conducted studies where they've weighted their results in order to guard against all sorts of other variables that might have skewed the results, to show that actually women enhance the profit margins, they don't reduce it. But if you look at boardrooms worldwide, you have only about 10% of women on boards. These inequalities continue to exist. I'm of a generation that we thought that within our lifetime we would see equality. We sort of thought that feminism was would no longer be necessary. And in fact, you see it sliding backwards. I'm slightly relieved by this list in one way because it doesn't have Miley Cyrus on it, which is one of the things that you find with a lot of these lists, is because there is such a shortage of good female examples that you get a lot of barrel scraping that goes on.
Well, we should explain who Miley Cyrus is. She's a pop singer who's recently been, shall we say, mired in controversy by seemingly putting out what is clearly not a feminist message in her on-screen performances.
The point about these lists is that usually people who are picked for them are in the spotlight at the moment. You do not pick somebody who has been away from the media, who has not been mentioned anywhere, and put him up there. You put people in who have been bang on, in the middle of attention, and the top 20 here, you could see they're always mentioned, they're always in the media. So that explains. As regards...
But Alexander, I mean, Virginia Rometty, we'll stick with the feminist theme for a moment. Virginia Rometty, who's the chief executive of IBM, I don't think many people in the street would know who she was.
Oh, no, she's known.
They would know who Miley Cyrus was.
A lot was written about her. Come on, this is not like that. So that is how it's picked. As regards, you asked why there are no journalists here. Journalists no longer decide anything. That's why they're not here. Now, when the Western media, and unfortunately the Russian media as well, became dependent on advertising, it lost its edge automatically. Because when you get a lot of money from somebody who pays you for his adverts, you cannot go against him. That is why when the financial crash happened, all the banks, all the lenders increased their advertising in the newspapers. And that's why nobody dared to stand up and say, guys, they need to go to jail.
I think that's one of the most peculiar theories I've heard. Your notion is that there was a crash, then the banks increased their advertising, and because of that, the newspapers stepped back.
That. Yes, they did. Because what they understood is that if you depend on your income, on the advertising income, and advertising income is the biggest income, you cannot attack a retail chain which gives you millions of pounds a year.
When was this glorious period when newspapers didn't depend on advertising? Because I've missed that.
No, but that's how it undermined them. There was less advertising, it grew and grew and grew, and now we see some newspapers, basically half of their content is advertising.
So when
you can't bite the hand that feeds you.
When a journalistic outlet depends instead on the backing of, for example, a state, that has much more integrity, in your view?
In my view, is that advertising has to be cut. Advertising should not be the main income, because newspapers are no longer objective and impartial, because they cannot touch these big companies that are paying millions.
I thought something very interesting about this list that we haven't touched upon is the national distribution, because we've talked a little about the fact that there's a Russian at the top. One of, I think, only two Russians on the list. The other one is Dmitry Medvedev.
Three. There's Alicia Usmanov.
Igor Sechin is the head of the Rosneft.
It's upsettingly, annoyingly, people aren't listed by nationality or even sort of region of the world, but it seems 50-60% American, then probably Asian, and then a bit European. I'd have assumed maybe 10 years ago it would have been almost 90% American.
And coming from an American-based publication, though we're very international, I absolutely would always expect a list to reflect its country of origin. Yeah. But this is absolutely a recognition of the rising power of.
But that's why, to go back to an earlier point, to me it does seem to be largely about money. For example, there is only one African on the list, Aliko Dangote, who's a Nigerian, surprise, surprise, chief executive of the world's richest African, but he is the only representative from Africa. There is, of course, Carlos Slim from Mexico up there at number 12. So it seems to be, if you want to break out of Mexico or Africa and be counted as powerful, you need to have an awful lot of money. Just to go back to the idea of journalism and influence and how many people you reach, we touched on Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. Who's not on it that absolutely should be in your view, Hugo?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I mean, we've got Google on there, we've got Facebook on there.
Do you look up to anybody? Do you admire somebody? Is there somebody that's giving you guidance in the world?
I mean, one of the greatest sort of changes in terms of certainly my perception of the world has been Twitter, and I don't see any Twitter voices on there. But again, it boils down to how we're talking about power.
Isn't real power about affecting the way people think about the world?
Well, I suppose it is. Not according to this list. You know, the opinion formers, as you said before. I mean, except for possibly the Pope. Otherwise, we're talking about the ability to exercise raw power, be it financial power or military. Or
to bring that together with your point, Catherine, about women, Malala Yousafzai, been on lots of lists, but she's not on this one. She's clearly got no money, but she's certainly affected the way a lot of people think, and the way a lot of people think about where she comes from and about how women fare in that cultural environment.
But Malala, she would be a good and forward-looking choice again, because she's clearly somebody who is becoming more and more influential, and who is articulating something that is incredibly important.
Although what she's articulating is relatively small scale, isn't it? It's one big idea.
Well, the one big idea, education for girls, is a huge idea.
Hugo, so if you're talking about influence and change, I mean, there's an absence of people like Julian Assange on this list, or Edward Snowden. I mean, it would be very strange to conceive that either one of them powerful. One of them lives in a cupboard and the other one's effectively disappeared. But if we're talking about changing people's perspectives on the world, making actions that have massive ramifications, they would both figure highly, although that's a very different sort of power from the power of somebody like Vladimir Putin.
Alexander, is there someone missing from this list who influences the world?
I would put the couple of directors of Goldman Sachs there, because they have really caused a lot of problems in the world economy, all by their own. There was a big problem in 2008. The system should have been reformed. It is not. We're heading for another crash. And I think that some of the people are powerful behind the scenes. We must remember that, because some of the richest people in the world are not known. So that is why this list, I think, is concentrating on people who have been in the news a lot, who are known to the readers of Forbes, who would not be asking questions, who is this? And I still believe that Vladimir Putin, out of all of them, at that particular moment played a crucial role in stopping a possible regional war in the Middle East. So I think it's a very proper thing here. We're talking about political power, but if we start criticizing each of these people for he's doing this wrong or that wrong, then it's going to be a disaster. We won't be able to basically compile a list.
Well, we must avoid disaster at all costs. Alexander Nekrassov from the controversial blog Stirring Up Trouble Internationally, thank you for joining us. And Catherine Mayer, editor-at-large for Time Magazine in Europe, and Hugo Rifkind from The Times in London. Thank you all for joining us here in London.